And joining us today from New Zealand, we have Dr. Leif Elinder, who's a former paediatrician and is now retired, living in New Zealand. Leif, how are you? It's morning for me, evening for you. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Good. You're 12 hours ahead. So I had a bit of trouble getting this set up, but here we are. We're all good.
No, we had a nice day. It's summer has come today, so the temperature in the sea is maybe 18, but in the air it's above 20 and quite pleasant. So, and I live out in a peninsula outside Auckland called Devonport, and close to the sea. And I live in a retirement village. Which is very comfortable, I must admit. So it's an easy lifestyle, very uncomplicated as such.
Perfect. And how did you end up in New Zealand from Sweden?
Well, I mean, when I left Australia, the contract to get the permission to work there was that you were only allowed to stay for 2 years. And when I left Australia, I felt at least I have to see New Zealand before I'm going back to Sweden. And then when I went with my family and 4 kids touring around New Zealand, then I felt that I would spend one day trying to see if I can get a job in New Zealand. And I had a friend in Auckland who helped me to organize telephone calls to 6 different hospitals. And in Vaccination, I was lucky to reach the superintendent, and he said, "Actually, I'm coming to Auckland tomorrow. Can I see you?" So we came up to Auckland, and I met him in Auckland, and he said, "You want to come to Vaccination and work?" And I said, "Of course." So
Perfect.
then I went back to Sweden, but I got a telegram at the time, 1985. "Do you want to come now, just before Christmas?" "Sure." So I came, and then I stayed 6 years and became a citizen.
And you've been there since?
Well, then the things calmed down after the split of or the when Soviet Union disintegrated into Russia, and my wife felt that we had family and parents in Sweden, so actually I went back to after 6 years, beginning of 1990.
But why did you?
Something like that, and
But
then
why?
I worked in Sweden as a pediatrician in Uppsala. It's a university city, and there I worked as a specialist for kids with special needs.
Right.
Pediatrician for kids with special needs. So that was my kind of speciality in Sweden.
But you were just telling me before we started that the reason why you moved to the other side of the world in the first place. That's pretty interesting. Could you tell us that?
Well, the reason was that it was during the Cold War between Russia, Soviet Union and America, and the establishment of Pershing II missiles, 2,000 on each side of the German border, more or less. And I felt that that's not a good future for kids if there would be a uncontrolled escalation. But then when I was in New Zealand, Gorbachev and I think it was Reagan, they agreed upon kind of more peaceful development between these two countries. And then my wife felt that she would be more comfortable back in Sweden, where we had parents and so forth. And my argument wasn't as strong any longer. So I agreed with her, and we went back to Sweden. And And then I had the option. Then I had become a New Zealand citizen. And when I became a New Zealand citizen, I lost my Swedish citizenship. You were not allowed to have dual citizenships at the time. Now you have. So now I have two passports. But anyway, I felt okay. I'll go back to Sweden then because my wife wanted that, and life and security looked a bit more peaceful for the future. And I got this job then in Uppsala, where I stayed till roughly 2015, I think.
So it's interesting that you decided back during the Cold War that you had to get out of the Northern Hemisphere, certainly Western Europe. I was actually, funnily enough, just 2 nights ago, I was speaking to my son, who's 10, and we were talking about, he said something about that Putin is the next, he's a psycho, he's the next Hitler or something like that. And so we ended up talking about the Cold War, and I showed him the map of the Iron Curtain.
Yes.
And, you're talking about all these countries we can freely go to nowadays, but it's quite difficult to explain to a 10-year-old that the world was crazy back then and that you had two different ideologies, and certain people in the Eastern countries couldn't leave. They put fences up so they couldn't get out. And obviously the Western guys couldn't get in unless you got special permission.
Yes.
But when I was telling him I was explaining to him the situation at the time and how, like 1984, 85, that there was like a real possibility of a nuclear war. And he couldn't believe it. And as I was saying it to him, I couldn't believe it that we were in that situation. I was living in the States at the time, which is not great. But at the whole point, what I told him, I was saying to him this, I said, this doesn't make any sense to me. This, I can't believe I lived through that. And I'd not forgotten it, but I hadn't even thought about it for, many, many years, up until like 1989, 1991, when the Berlin Wall finally fell. It was a strange time. It was a very, very strange time. And explaining him the situation and how crazy the whole thing was, and explaining to him what communism was, this advanced form of socialism, the people had no rights, the government owned everything, and it was not a very nice place to live. I'm sure it had some benefits, but in the long run, well, we could see what happened. But I was going to ask you about, because when we had a chat last Friday, that was really interesting because we align I say align the way we think, but I wouldn't quite say it's an alignment. It's more of a being able or trying to be as balanced looking at a situation as possible.
Be flexible. I mean, the world is very unpredictable, and the best option now, and that's the advice I give people, go for flexibility so that you have different options, because what is right now could be completely different in next week, more or less.
Yeah.
So if you have flexibility in regard to profession and where you can live, it's a good strategy.
And so one of the things you were telling me on the phone last week is, I didn't realize, I was speaking to my wife being a Swede who's friends with one of your daughters. And she was my wife was saying, yeah, he was quite famous in Sweden because you were challenging the I don't know whose decision it was, but the narrative, because you were dealing with children, you're challenging the narrative about ADHD.
That's right. I mean, I had the position then at Uppsala as a specialist with kids with special needs. And then the leading professor in psychiatry, Christopher Ilberg, he had a big debate article in the main paper about that 10% roughly of all kids have ADHD, and he called it a neuropsychiatric disease or handicap, a brain hereditary brain dysfunction, and that they needed to be diagnosed by medical specialists and were candidates for medical treatment for their deficiency, neurological hereditary deficiency, and as I, the doctor said, we have to find this. One child in 10 should have the diagnosis and been sent to psychiatrists or specialists for drugs or whatever. And I became a bit dubious about that, and so I wrote an article that where I questions these statements, and I got a very rude reply. So I felt, have I totally misunderstood the whole question? So I felt I have to study it really thoroughly. So I started off trying to read everything, all his research, where he based all his facts upon. So I got all his official writings and theses, and I felt he couldn't have done that in the way he says. So I became a little bit suspicious. So I asked to see his raw data. Basically, it was a study where he had diagnosed kids with ADHD and followed them for 10, 15 years. And on that data, four doctors gained their doctor's thesis on that material. So I wanted to see the raw data, and they said, no, you can't do that. And I wrote to the dean of Gothenburg, and the dean said, no, it's secret. So I went to the court, and unexpectedly the court said, yes, I have the right to see it. But they refused. So I went to the court 3 times, and every time they said that I had the right to see it, and they refused. And I went up to the university. I wanted to see this. No, you can't do it. They really refuse. And then I went to the enforcement authority, and they were going to, forcefully get it from a university. And then I learned that they destroyed everything. It was 100,000 pages destroyed illegally. And so then it became a big court case because it was the material of the university. So that they were sentenced in court, including the dean. And that was interesting. I saw the police report, and they questioned the dean then, the prosecutor, why didn't you follow the court's order? And I read the police protocols, and when the prosecutor asked the dean that, well, I couldn't hand it over. There were threats about suicide, they said. So I couldn't hand it over.
So the researchers were going to commit suicide?
Well, I just read from the protocols, from the police report, there were threats about suicide. So I couldn't hand it over. But anyway, the court didn't buy that. So the dean was sentenced because he didn't follow the court's order. And the researchers, or 3 of them, I think, were sentenced in court. And the dean resigned after that because he was convicted in the court. And they brought it later up to the European court twice, and they lost there as well. But for me, it took roughly 10 years. And they contacted my employer as well in Uppsala and wanted me sacked. But as I won all the court cases, they couldn't sack me. They tried to silence me. They called, because I wrote articles about it all the time. And my employer called me for a hearing about I was spoiling the reputation for doctors. But in Sweden, we have a freedom of speech. law that says that if you are employed by the government, you're allowed to speak freely in newspapers. I mean, that's freedom of speech law from 1700. And so I challenged my employer by going to the ombudsman and telling them that they're calling me for questioning about what I'm writing in the papers. So my employer got a very strong reprimand from the Swedish ombudsman. So then they didn't dare to touch me. And then I won all the court cases. So basically I was free to do whatever I liked for 10 years, which I spent quite a lot of time fighting in these court cases. And I did it by myself. I didn't have any private lawyer. I had to do the job myself. I had a friend who was a lecturer at the university, but he did it because he was interested in freedom of speech. So I mean, it was an interesting 10 years, and I spent time also, what you call it, people came to, I mean, people, this diagnosis ADHD, there are no specific tests to prove that you have AD. It's basically how a psychiatrist interpret the story from parents and teachers. I mean, there are no specific. So basically, theoretically, you can diagnose the kids on the telephone, because when you examine the child, he can behave as any child, and still to get a diagnosis from the story, the interpretation of the story from parents and teachers, and they can read about what to say on the internet. So, I mean, basically, it's a completely arbitrary diagnosis, and it varies from place to place, from 0.5% to 26%. Samuel Timimi, a professor in England, which I've been in contact with at the time, he stated that in an article that this variation, 50 times, the prevalence varied from 0.5% in certain regions up to 25%, depending on who was the head of the psychiatric department in that area. So it's a completely arbitrary diagnosis. It doesn't mean that all kids are without defects, but hereditary defects, to my estimate, is 0.5%, between 0.5 and 1%, but not 10, 15, or 25. So it's above the 1% level. It's a completely arbitrary diagnosis. It's ADHD is in 95% of the cases a cultural phenomenon. It's under certain circumstances you have difficulties for various reasons, but less than 1% is hereditary, and that was my argument, and I think it's still, that argument is still valid. So anyway, for me it was an interesting period, and parents, they wanted the diagnosis when the children were young because they got certain benefits, and the teachers got an extra teachers. But then when they're looking for a job 10 years later, and they felt that this is a disadvantage to have this diagnosis, they came to me and asked, can you take off this diagnosis, which I did freely. Now they have to pay for it, but I mean, I was employed by the Uppsala commune. So, but I mean, I what you call it, liberated the kids, everyone I saw, basically, from the diagnosis then, for free. I mean, I got my salary, but it was interesting, and I felt pretty certain they couldn't fire me, or because I had the courts on my side. So it was an interesting period. Yeah.
So what is it then? Is that a scam?
Well, in most of the cases, yes.
Yeah. And is that, do you think so? I mean, we saw a lot of, well, let's call it dishonest behavior from pharmaceutical companies over the
Yes.
past, well,
Yes.
since the beginning, really. And do you think that, I mean, was there any hint? I mean, I'm trying to see both sides of the story here. But do you think there was the researchers who destroyed the 100,000 pages worth of research that you wanted to look at? Do you think that they were being funded? Was there any sort of impropriety?
I'm sure they had funds from the drug companies, and they organized, after they were fined, they organized gatherings for patients. They had a ADHD society, and they organized funding to pay the researchers' fines. The patient
What?
to pay their funds, yes.
The patients did.
Pay their funds.
Is that not?
What do you call it? Riksförbundet Attention. That's the Swedish name. It was a society for children with ADHD, and they had the leading professors as their heroes, and you could belong to that society, and they tried to smear you all the time. I mean, during my fight for this, you were smeared all the time. You know, it had certain tricks for that, but I wasn't so worried about that. And the funny thing was that when they were finally convicted and fined, they organized a fundraise to pay the researchers who had acted illegally to pay their fines.
But is that not a classic case of cognitive dissonance? Am I using that term correctly?
Well, possibly, yeah. You can call it whatever you like, but I mean, but for me, it was interesting, and I was very fortunate because I had the courts on my side all the time. And I also had I wasn't alone. I had a sociologist, Eva Kärve. So we worked together, but and she had the same idea as me, but from a sociological perspective.
I did it was something online I saw, and it was to do with it was like a 10-point do you have ADHD check. So I thought, hey, I'll give this a go. I was pretty sure I knew what the answer was going to be at the end of it.
Sure.
And I went tick, 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 tick all the way down. Do you have difficulty? Do you have difficulty concentrating on tasks that bore you?
Yeah,
absolutely. I can't. I got no time for that. You know. But I went through the whole thing, and I thought, this is. I mean, that's pretty much every guy I know. And my little brother, when he was in his teens, and he is a high energy guy.
Cool.
You know, you could say hyperactive, but he is. You hear that word getting bandied around, but that guy is still to this. I mean, he's in his 40s now, and he is still a real bundle of energy. And so my parents were going nuts, and they were going crazy from this kid. So they took him, and he was diagnosed, and they gave him drugs.
Yeah.
And God bless him, he absolutely refused. He said, "Mum, this is all nonsense. I'm not taking these drugs. Absolutely no chance."
Obviously a clever child, then. Yep.
Well, he might disagree with you, but or I might disagree with you. No, he was smart enough to realize what was going on. I was just doing a quick check before we came on that you got drugs like Ritalin and Adderall.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so I post that, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, because one of my friends.
It makes you more, what do you call it, cut off from the environment, so the teachers can find it beneficial in some way, because the child becomes more silent, more isolated from the surroundings, and so from that perspective. But I think long-term effects of Ritalin is negative.
Well, yeah, I was looking at the ingredients list here,
Oh, it's
and
amphetamine compound.
amphetamine. So, folks, that's meth. They're giving meth to kids so they can sit down and concentrate.
That's right. So they become more focused, but cut off from the environment. And I think in the long run, plus the side effects, it's to their disadvantage for sure.
That's what I've done a podcast with this as well, with a historian from World War II, of World War II rather, and talking about, and at the moment I can't remember the name of the drug. Begins with a P, I think, but the Germans were using was methamphetamine.
For sure.
And the British were using it as well, and it had catastrophic. I mean, it was great for the first few days.
Exactly.
And then, but with a couple of weeks of prolonged abuse, it has catastrophic.
There are side effects, and well, there are several side effects. But it all depends. I mean, some kids didn't even take it; they sold it.
I'll bet they did.
So how do you know that they? You were not sure whether they took it or not. In many cases, you could sell the drug and earn money from it. So I mean, no, it's the whole thing is a mess.
But it goes back to money.
Sure, and therefore I took an interest in medical research, and I have my expression that I explained to you, fire. I mean, what's your interest? And I say, my interest is I'm looking for fire, and fire is for me free thinking, internationally respected experts. Free thinking, that's F. Internationally, I respected experts. And for me, my aim now is to find free thinking, internationally respected experts, and they are basically establishment whistleblowers. And in regard to medical research, I find two people that I followed quite closely. One was John Ioannidis. He wrote an article saying most published research findings are wrong. Most published medical findings are wrong. That was John Ioannidis, professor at Stanford, professor in medical statistics, one of the most respected medical statisticians in the world, wrote that. So more than 50% of the published is wrong. And there's another one that I've been in contact with at the time was Peter Götze. He was also professor in medical statistics at Copenhagen. He was a leading figure for the Cochrane Institute. That's an institute that scrutinizes, examines medical research. So that's a body, internationally recognized body for examining medical research. And basically, he came to the same conclusion, and he wrote a book called Deadly Medicine and Criminal Activity. Deadly Medicine and Criminal Activity was the drug companies. And Peter Götze is professor in medical statistics, professor, well cited, written more, published in recognized magazines, most doctors. So both Peter Götze and John Ioannidis were two people that I followed, that quoted, and I was in contact with Peter Götze, and there were a number of also editors-in-chief for medical journals, Lancet and British medical journals. These editors-in-chief, Richard Horton and Maria Angel, and from recognized papers. Now, I mean, this was 20 years ago, but they said basically the same thing, that there's a lot of corruption and biased biased research and ghostwriting. The companies, they pick up a well-known figure in medicine and they write the article for him and they pay him and they put his name there. So there is a lot of dishonesty within that branch, unfortunately. Some of the research can be excellent. I mean, I'm not saying that everything is bad, but when the two leading figures, especially John Ioannidis, say that over 50% or 50% is wrong for various reasons. Quite a lot.
It's astonishing, and it's annoying because it just seems to be it's money. It's a dirty business. There's a lot of money at stake.
Yeah,
a lot of money at stake.
And it was the same thing with that's another thing. I mean, speaking about FIRE, free thinking, or internationally recognized experts. It was the same thing with the COVID vaccination and how it was developed and whether it was good or not. And the more you read about it, the more skeptical you be about the whole thing. But that's a long story. I can't discuss that now. But
I was going to ask you actually, because Sweden was unusual. I went to Sweden during the COVID times because my wife, we have a family. Well, she's got family there, and we go there. I go there. Well, usually once or twice a year, and it was great to come back to Sweden. And of course, the government health expert, I forget his name, but bless him as well. What a guy. He said, no, you can't mandate these injections because it goes against everything, against all the laws. And because he is, and I forget his name, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. And he was, all sorts of shit was thrown at that guy, which is quite staggering when you think about it, because what he was doing his job and it was very clearly laid out what his powers were, that he was a government advisor, and what he said, his effectively what he said was law.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the guy's name? I'm trying to remember. I can't remember his name.
I in my age,
right.
I'm sure I know the names, but at the moment, I mean,
it's okay. Don't worry about that. It's just, I find it very interesting that Sweden is, well, I think probably was one of the very, very few countries that actually said, no, we can't do this. This goes against every convention, internationally recognized treaty we've got. You can't force people to get a vaccination.
No, but they were promoting the vaccination. So I was skeptical about the Swedish approach as well, but it wasn't as strict as in other countries. That's true. But there are many doubts there, to say the least.
Yeah, that is probably a different conversation.
Sorry?
That's another podcast, that one.
Oh, yeah, that's another podcast. That's but I spent some time studying that as well, but we won't have time to discuss that now.
No, because there's a lot of bad stuff happen there as well. I have become, I wasn't always like this. I was, I guess we were all brought up the same way, Sweden especially is a place where, and a high trust society, and, the government does the best for the people and they wouldn't lie, and they, et cetera, et cetera. But as we now know, that's not true. But whenever something, if ever something for me is being pushed very hard, and bearing in mind, I was in the military, I was in the army during, Iraq, and all these things. And
Mm.
at the time, because I was working in the army headquarters,
Okay.
so I was privy to quite a lot of the information of what was going on. And we knew what was going on. And what they were saying, the politicians were saying on TV was, at best, bullshit. And at worst, downright,
Yeah. No,
malicious what's going to happen.
I'm very disappointed now, and for many reasons, yes.
And so since then, and I was apparently it's a thing is when once you become a captain in the army, you basically become one of the most cynical class of people there is, because you start to see things how actually they really work, because you're idealistic when you join, and then you start to see how they make the sausage, as we say. And since then, well, I guess that was probably my first introduction to it. Bear in mind, I got an anthrax vaccination. I've been called anti-vax recently, and I've had an anthrax vaccination, which is, I tell you what, is horrible. Talk about side effects. And so now whenever something is being pushed as a narrative, it's just being pushed relentlessly on media and social media and everywhere, government people saying it. I immediately look for who are the people who are standing up against this narrative, and find out what's going on. And at the time, over the last 5 years, there were people who were getting cancelled. They were losing their jobs. Sometimes they're getting put in jail. And I thought, this is very, very interesting. What are these people saying? And they were smeared, like what happened to you. They were smeared.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that too. The most common thing is derogatory labeling.
Yeah.
Anti-Semite, anti-vaxxer, climate change denier, conspiracy theorist, and so you have these labels. And the other one is guilt by association. These are the two techniques. Guilt by association. Oh, Putin would be very happy if he heard that, or whatever. So that's guilt by association. This kind of McCarthyism. If you were a socialist, you were a communist. So guilt by association and derogatory labeling, and that's what ignorant people or hypocrites use that technique.
Mm. Yeah, I've been called a Putin puppet.
Oh yeah. That's typical. That's the easiest way. Derogatory technique is guilt by association.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I was going to ask you this, because you put out quite a lot of opinion on these things. What are your views on Sweden joining NATO?
No, it's a disaster, of course. Disaster.
I agree.
And it doesn't benefit Sweden at all. And it was, I mean, they've been neutral for 200 years, and this was decided without reference. The politicians decided that suddenly. Why they did it, I don't know, but they didn't do it for the benefit of Swedes. There were other reasons. You can speculate what kind of reasons there were.
Speculate, please.
No, there's no point. You can speculate. But it was, I think this was, to say the least, a very big mistake, and the reasons were not fair. That I have to be cautious now when I express myself.
Oh, right. I didn't realize. Well, I can speculate. Do you want me to?
Oh, it's up to you.
Oh, well, we can slide up. I think it's because they got Finland and they got Sweden in, because they were the last two.
Okay.
In the EU, and they needed them in the coalition. But I think it's a terrible idea, personally, and they basically put their country in the crosshairs of any future conflict. Yeah. And I don't think people quite realize how serious the situation is. Like I said, I was talking to my son, and we were talking about that very point, about how close we came to nuclear war in the mid 80s, and what happened in the 60s in the Bay of Pigs, Cuba, and it's happening again. And so I'm trying to explain to a 10-year-old kid that the severity of the situation, and it's, this could very easily go nuclear because of the situation we're in.
Absolutely.
And he said, okay, but we're all right. We're in Switzerland. It's neutral. And I said, well, no, they've been providing money and ammunition and material to Ukraine as well. So they've effectively given up that neutrality. I think there was quite a lot of pushback in Switzerland about that. Said, hey, we're not absolutely not allowed to do that. We're neutral. So there was people smart enough to say, hey, this is not on. And it's really depressing for me to have to explain to my kids that this is the situation we're in, and it just seems to be such an easy thing to fix. But I don't know. What do you think?
My approach is, and I'm citing Jewish. Most of my intellectual heroes are Jews, and one is Hannah Arendt, who says that evil comes from failure to think. Evil comes from failure to think. She covered the Adolf Eichmann process. She was a philosopher and writer, and she wrote the book The Banality of Evil. But anyway, one of her statements is evil comes from failure to think, and that's the situation we are in now. And then our obligation as human beings, I feel, is if I feel something is wrong, I have a moral obligation to say that. I'm not sure if I'm right, but if I feel that this might be beneficial for you to know, I should say it. If I sit silently, I have sinned. If I sit silently, I have to speak out. Doesn't mean that I must be right, but I must speak out. And for me, then, is to find people who are trustworthy whistleblowers, and to find them, I think it's possible. And my ideas are not original at all. I just copy what my fire experts say. One is Noam Chomsky, of course. Another one is Jeffrey Sachs, advisor to 3 United Nations secretary, and one there's another organization called VIPS, Veteran CIA Intelligence Officer for Sanity, Ray McGovern. Basically they are, or Charles Freeman, previous ambassador for the United States, or Jack Matlock during peace negotiations with Khrushchev. They can now speak freely. They are now fire experts. They don't have to think about their own career. They've passed that stage. Now they are not thinking about themselves. They are thinking about their children and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I find my alternative information, finding such people, also whistleblowers who are internationally recognized. They are professors, they have written many books, and they have nothing personally to gain from this apart from thinking about their children and grandchildren. And one of them is Judge Napolitano, who interviews these people. Another one is Glenn Diesen. He's a professor in political analysis in Norway, as a Norwegian professor. Pascal Lotas is another one who interviews basically the same people. So my ideas are not original at all. I just copy the information I get from these people who are internationally recognized as experts, written many books, they are professors, and they do it not for themselves, but for others.
Yeah, I agree. Jeffrey Sachs, because when I try to, you get into these conversations with people, and I'm much better now. But when you challenge people, when one is challenged, one gets upset,
That's
not
right.
just saying me, but just in general. And it quite quickly can turn into an argument, and it's no good. And when you're having your beliefs challenged, and for me as well, it's the same for everyone. So it's so when I'm trying to explain some things, like, what the hell do you know? You're not an expert. And I say, well, okay, I'll send you this YouTube video of, let's say, Ray Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs or any of these experts saying pretty much exactly the same thing.
Exactly.
And bless them for doing what they were doing, because I wouldn't have known,
No, exactly. I copy what they're saying because they are trustworthy.
Yeah, and when I heard these guys, I went, I've been saying that for years now. I've had a very senior NATO gent, in fact, two. One was the deputy Supreme Allied. He was the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO. Is always an American general, and the deputy is a European. And he was it was an old boss of mine. Was the deputy, so extremely senior guy, and it's number 2 in NATO.
That's right.
And we discussed. In fact, we did a podcast because he wrote a book. I think it was called War with Russia. There you go. How about that? But it was a novel, pretty good book. I read it, and then we did a podcast about it. And the very next day, the special operation, whatever they call it, the Russians call it, but they went into Ukraine the very next day, which is great for the podcast, but not great for Ukrainians and Russians. But he was, I'm not sure if he's a hawk as such, a war hawk, but he was very hawkish on the whole thing. He said that Russia were definitely the bad guy in this piece. And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's not really any good people in the whole situation. But what's pretty clear to me is that there is a major push for war with Russia, and there has been for a good few years. And I mean, the only thing I could think of really is the fact that most of the European countries and America as well are in unbelievable amounts of debt. Britain, I think, it just hit 3 trillion in debt, or is about to hit 3 trillion in debt. And a great way to get rid of debt is to have a war. And so, I mean, going back to the basest of base analysis of it, it's money again.
Yes, that's certainly an important part of the whole story. Yes, power and money. Power and money.
Because none of this rationally, to me, makes any sense.
No.
And strangely enough, though, when I speak to my military friends now, I see them quite often. We realize what the situation is, and they can't really talk out. They got the ones that are still in the military. They can't really talk out. They can't really go off page because
they lose their career. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
But if you want to be promoted, you better be conform to what your superiors are saying.
Yeah. It's not good.
That's how, and it's the same thing in the Swedish parliament. I mean, I don't feel that the ordinary member of parliament represent us. They represent their own career, and if they press the button the right way, they are promoted and they get a high pension and some pseudo jobs and in various government organizations and a good lifestyle. If they follow what the hierarchy is saying, they don't represent ordinary people any longer.
No.
So I'm very disappointed. And that applies to all the parties.
Me too. There's one thing I was going to ask you, seeing as you've got a stance on, you're willing to take a stance on things that you find to be wrong, is there's a lot of chat lately, especially in America, with with RFK Jr. being in charge of the health and the HHS, whatever they call it, the health department. Yeah. And he's on this rampage against removing neurotoxins let's call them what they are, aluminium and mercury and things out of vaccines.
Yes.
Do you have a strong view on the vaccine question? Because a lot of doctors and professionals who were once pro-vax are vehemently anti-vaccination now for
No,
kids.
I've been a pediatrician and I never opposed to vaccines before, but now after COVID, I've changed my mind, thinking that some vaccinations surely are beneficial, like polio and smallpox and a few other things. But to vaccinate people every year for flu, for recurrent mutations for certain viruses, I think jeopardizes your immune system. So, I mean, I've been for vaccinations, but selectively. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but not vaccinate for anything. I mean, obviously, I mean, your immune system doesn't have. It's like in the military. If you want to be able to defend yourself against anything, you can't defend anything at all. So you have to find a smart compromise. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm there is a limit, and COVID vaccination, I think, does more harm than good. Totally.
And do you think that's because it's not, these aren't traditional vaccines as we're
Oh, it's. I mean, here we are we are introducing a spike protein that is toxic per se, and then you are supposed to create antibodies against that, and so it's not a traditional vaccine. It's a new product, and how it came about, and how it was examined, and the side effects. One chap, I think, he's not a specialist himself, but he's trustworthy. That's John Campbell. Do you know him? He has a blog, 3 million people. He's a lecturer originally for nurses, but he has a doctor's degree in lecturing medicine, and he has a blog, John Campbell, and he has followed the whole program for 5 years, and he was beginning of his show. He has interviewed hundreds of specialists, professors during this 5-year period. John Campbell, you have to. He's very, very trustworthy. He took the first 3 vaccinations, and then he realized after a couple of years, I've been misinformed, and he has changed his mind. And he has interviewed, I would say, hundreds of specialists, and basically that's what they're saying. And one thing I just found interesting, I was in India and Sri Lanka months ago, and so I was a bit interested in the policy in India, and in the biggest state, Uttar Pradesh, with 240 million people, they introduced ivermectin. You know ivermectin?
yes, I
They
do.
got a Nobel Prize for it against parasites. But some doctors found that it was very effective against COVID. So in Uttar Pradesh, with 240 million people, they more or less advised, they got it for free, or paid $1, and they got the 10 days treatment, provided you took the tablets as soon as you had a flu or fever. You just took a 10 days course of ivermectin, the safest drug in the world. It's safer than paracetamol. I mean, you take it against parasites. I mean, basically, in Uttar Pradesh, they eradicated COVID with this simple drug. Cheap, safe, and they ridicule those who promoted it. Oh, it's a horse medication. Well, penicillin is a horse medication then as well. I mean, you give penicillin to the horses. You don't call it horse medicine. Ivermectin is against parasites. I'm not vaccinated, and I took ivermectin, but they increased the price for it in Sweden hundreds or 200 times because they wanted to stop it. And I tried to get it in New Zealand, and then I had to prove that I had scabies. Otherwise, I couldn't get it. Before you could get it for free, more or less. But they basically, the drug companies, they increased the price 100 times. If a tablet costs $1, it was $100, you know, for one tablet. Well, it's just insane. Or they stopped it completely. And that's criminal.
Yeah, that is
It's
criminal.
criminal. It's also ivermectin is one of the safest drugs in the world. They got the Nobel Prize for it against parasites, but you couldn't get it
Mm.
just because it was so effective against COVID, provided you took it straight on, not
Mhm.
when you were really sick. I mean, then you should take it the first day you were sick or second. I mean, then it was extremely effective, plus certain vitamins, vitamin D and other things. But they had a combination. But basically in Uttar Pradesh, from what I have read, and John Campbell interviewed many people who are stating this, and the people he interviewed seems to be very knowledgeable and reliable. And you should look at him. He's respected. I mean, and he interviews very knowledgeable and merited people all the time. And he's done that now for 5 years.
Yeah, I'll
John
check him
Campbell.
out. I love these guys.
No, I mean, I promise you won't be disappointed.
John Campbell. Funnily enough, I tell you what I found very, very surprising about the whole COVID thing is, and I'm sure you did too, was that there was actually a cure for flu. And you took zinc, you took vitamin D3, you took ivermectin, and there was a Z-Pack, whatever it is, some other things. And if you took this, then the symptoms would clear up really, really quickly. And another thing I thought growing up, I mean, people say, oh, I've got the flu, and you're in bed for 5 days and you feel like death, but then after 4 or 5 days or whatever, you come back to life and you feel better. And then a paramedic told me, so that's not flu. A flu is 2 to 3 weeks. And I have had that once. And after 2.5 weeks, 2 weeks, I'm starting to think, am I gonna make it? Lying in bed, nearly crying, thinking, I'm gonna have to go to hospital soon because I feel dreadful, and there's nothing I could do. And then actually, probably about 2.5 to 3 weeks, it cleared up, and I felt absolutely fine. But most people haven't actually had a flu, and I think that was in 2005, early 2006. I think it was a swine flu or a bird flu outbreak somewhere. That must have got a bad strain of it. But you don't even get taught that flu, there's a difference between a bad cold and a flu and influenza. And I could understand, and I was 33, 34 at the time, 32, 33. So I was, prime of life. And I was laid out. I was weak as a kitten, could barely get out of bed. It felt absolutely terrible. But then you find out there's actually things you can do. And all I was getting was, ibuprofen and paracetamol. And that was it. And then I tried to thought, if this happens again, I'll try and get some ivermectin. So I had a friend here, a pharmacist friend, who got some for me. And then I went back and asked him again. He said, absolutely not. That stuff doesn't work. I never gave it to you in the first place. That just blatant lies to my face. And I said, what are you talking about? I bought it from you and you charged a fortune for it. And he said, no, I never did. That would never happen. So maybe, people found out he had it or something. I don't know.
I mean, some people were sacked because they advised against, in Sweden even, I mean, pediatricians were advised against vaccination of kids. I mean, and they lost that job. I mean, so Sweden didn't behave in a good way either. And I just felt I was very lucky myself that didn't happen to me.
Mm-hmm. And you'd retired by then.
I retired, yes.
Perfect. Well, that's the thing is once you get to a certain age, you just stop caring about what people think.
That's
How
right.
old are you? How old do you live? You're 82.
I'm actually 82.
Yeah, that's it. That's a good age just
Yeah.
to unload. But that was really interesting chat there, and I understand it's late now in New Zealand, so you want to be. Plus, I've got stuff to do as well, so I've got to get off. But anything you want to finish on, then we can. I'll let you go.
Okay, no, but great chatting to you, and when everybody has the same opinion, doesn't mean that nobody is thinking. But when you speak about controversial matters, then it encourages you to think. And my last word in all discussions now is, I'm not trying to persuade you that I'm right. I might be wrong. We had a monk, Björn Natiko Lindeblad, I think. He became a monk and in northern Thailand for 17 years, and then he came back and had lectures in Sweden, and then he got ALS, a neurodegenerative disease, and he organized assisted suicide, which I've written an article about, which I support. So he organized that assisted suicide rather than to be put in a ventilator like Stephen Hawking or progressive paralyzed. So when he was in a wheelchair, he had a great party, and then said farewell to all his friends and people who have listened to his lectures about Buddhism. And then he organized an assisted suicide. And I think that was very honest. But he wrote a book, I May Be Wrong. I may be wrong. And that's how I finish all my discussions. I may be wrong, but I still feel an obligation to think this might be useful for you. But if you don't believe me, then it's up to you. But then I've done my duty.
That would be a great tattoo for you, Leif. Just get that tattooed on your arm. I may be wrong.
Yeah, that's a good. That kind of saves you from
hubris,
being a besserwisser or whatever. I mean,
yeah,
everybody can be wrong, but if I sit silently, I have sinned.
Yeah.
Einstein said the same thing. Albert Einstein, he said, we live in a dangerous world, not primarily because of evil people, because of those who sees what's happening, but they don't say anything. That's a quote from Albert Einstein.
And he was a smart guy.
He was a smart guy. Yeah.
All right, Leif, 1,000 thanks for coming on. That was really fun. I love that chat.
Thanks for taking your time, helping me, because I'm not so smart any longer, especially not with computers. And I should have been able to fix that, but you had the very good, what do you call it?
Instruction.
Goodwill to let me try till I succeeded.
It only took us 50 minutes. That's okay.
Yes.
That's okay.
Yes.
All right, Leif Elinder, thank you so much. What an interesting guy. Maybe we'll try and do this again. Now,
I'm just copying what other smarter people are saying.
Yeah, but you had a principled stance against ADHD and the nonsense that was going on about that. And that's, I applaud you for that. That's brilliant. Anyway, Leif, thank you so much. We'll see you again. Take care. Thanks for listening.